Welcome, everybody. I know there's still more people coming in. We'll maybe give it a little bit more time, maybe another minute. We're kind of running behind already. And then we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, Cheryl, Tammy, Helene, everyone. So this is Dr. Verena Brown. She's the child abuse pediatrician at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. Because we're already running a couple minutes behind, we're going to go ahead and get started. But if you have any questions, you could put it in the chat. This is a webinar, so you can just, I guess, raise your hand. However you want to do it, Dr. Brown, if you wanted to take questions at the end, whatever you feel comfortable. I'll keep track if people raise their hands or put something in the chat.
And I'll do little stops in between, so just to kind of, have segments where we gather questions too.
Great, awesome.
Okay, if you guys are ready, we can get started. So I'm Dr. Verena Brown. I am one of the child abuse pediatricians here at CHOA, along with Dr. Steve Messner. You guys may have heard his lecture yesterday with Angie Boy, who's one of our prevention specialists. So that's our team. But today we're going to be talking about healthy child sexual development and sex ed in general. Mostly how to provide sex ed. We'll be giving you guys sex ed. But this is one of my very favorite topics to talk about, because I think that that's something that we're not used to hearing about. And it's just really helpful, not only for people who work with kids, but people who like are parents and have kids. So it's useful information. So I hope you guys find it useful as well. So what we're going to focus on today is we're going to understand what's healthy and normal in regular child development as far as sexual developmental behaviors. And then from there, we're going to talk about what are the problem behaviors, so you can differentiate, what's okay, what's not okay. And then we're going to talk a lot about how adults shape child sexual development, whether we want to or not. So when we look at this topic, and certainly when I was putting this talk together, there's just not a whole lot of literature out there on what's healthy and normal as far as child sexual development. There's quite a bit on problem behaviors, which is helpful, but not so much on what we should expect as people who deal with children every day. And part of it is sort of our in this culture, our cultural presumption that children don't have any sort of sexual development until they hit puberties and the hormones go crazy and you're like, oh my God, now I'm a sexual person. There's a presumption that kids aren't curious. And if they are curious, that might be problematic. So we really want to differentiate, what actually is the case here, because we have different body parts, from the time of birth, and we do have hormones from early on, and we do have things that we're curious about. So we're going to talk about that. But part of this kind of taboo-ishness of the topic is coming from a place of not having a lot of literature, but also attempting to keep kids safe. It's kind of like the old thought process that if you don't talk about things, then the things won't happen. So if you don't talk about sex and sexuality, then nothing bad will happen to you, right? Which we kind of understand is not necessarily the case. So it's important to know what's normal, what's not normal, and it's important to talk about that, because at the end of the day, opposite to the common belief that if you don't talk about things, nothing bad will happen, we know as educators and people that work in the field of child protection that knowledge does in fact lead to safety. So that's the premise that we're going to be thinking about and holding as we hear this lecture. So the theory was that your sexuality is essentially dormant until you hit puberty, and then, like we said, our hormones go crazy and you're like, I'm a sexual person. And that there's this fear that sexual behaviors outside of puberty are abnormal and bad, right? And there's been so many different people who have touched on these kind of things and touched on sexuality in general, from people like Freud to Erikson, through anthropologists, through people who do feminist studies and talk about this in their studies as well. So some stuff in the social literature, some stuff in the medical literature, and that's what we're trying to put together here. So it's really difficult to study childhood sexuality in the moment that is happening, right, to children. So what people have been doing in order to get a better grasp of what happens in childhood is trying to capture the memories of people who, well, capture the memories of grownups to look back at what their childhoods were like, so that they can kind of paint a picture for us, right? And so the other thing is too is parental reporting. So take a bunch of parents, what are your kids doing at different stages, to sort of cohort them to see what's normal. And that's how modern studies have done to study child sexual development. But what's come out of it, and what you guys are going to see during this talk, is that it's hard to know what counts as really a sexual behavior versus what is just like normal stimulus behavior. So if you think about, a kid masturbating, I'm going to say masturbation a lot in this lecture, just to warn you guys, is that really sexual for them? Or is it like they're picking their nose, right? Oh, I have a penis, I found it, it's just there. I have a nose, there's a hole in it, I'm gonna pick it, right? And so I think what happens is a lot of times we look at certain behaviors and we, as grownups, sexualize them because we may practice them in a sexual way, versus children, it is just a body part that they have and that they have found. And they may touch it or play with it or, explore with it like they would their hands or their fingers, their feet, their skin. Like it's like, this is who I am, and I'm getting to know myself, right? So we have to think about, when we look at these normal childhood behaviors, are their intention really for a sexual end? Or is it more of, this is my body and I want to know what it does? I think if we kind of focus it on that way and step into that kind of lens, they're a little bit easier to digest. Because we know that there are things that we have to examine in context. So for example, we know from studies way back when in the 70s to more recent ones that babies have what we would consider sexual responses, but are they really? Probably not. So little boys will have erections, for example, and little girls will have vaginal lubrication as babies, and it has to do with fluctuating hormones at the time right after infancy, and a whole lot of other things. They're babies. We know that those things aren't happening for sexual gratification of any way, but they're still occurring physiologically, right? So again, thinking about that in the context of physiology versus the way that we adults think about these things. We also know that 36%, it's probably higher than this, but it was captured in the study, 36% of infants play with their genitals. It's not really masturbatory. It's just, I have genitals. I'm going to play with them. Also going to stick my hands in my mouth. Also going to suck my thumb. Just body part. Let me do something with it, right? So taking it out of the context of this has to be a sexual thing. So when we're looking at things that are healthy and normal, there are going to be some age ranges where certain behaviors are common. And we're going to also talk about later the things that aren't common and that we should, at that point, really pay attention to and get concerned about. So these behaviors are typically high frequency, and you find them amongst multiple cultural groups. it seems like it is part of a thing that children do, just like they learn to talk and they learn to walk, right? So for toddlers to early elementary, so 2 to 5 years of age, the things that you're going to find commonly are things like self-stimulation, and that's very common. And that is, can be a pleasurable thing, but it's not necessarily for sexual means, right? It's just like, I find my genitals, I get funny, nice feelings when I touch them, right? And you don't know the context of what that is in a kind of a grown-up way. The other thing is exhibitionism. So, you think about your a 3-year-old who likes to run around the house naked. I have 3 boys at my house, ages from 7 to 3. And I have experienced this myself. So if you have kids, like they'll walk and then they'll tell me, they'll be like, "Mommy, look, I'm naked." And it's just completely normal. You just have to kind of like, yes, you are. You have a body, you are naked. So that's pretty common. Voyeurism, so being curious about nudity. So, this is the kid that somebody's in the bathroom and they'll open the door and be like, "Hi," and they just want to see what's going on. And this is more like, okay, I know what my body looks like. What does everybody else's bodies look like? Do they look the same as mine, or do they look different? Are we all have the same parts? So that's a very common thing around this age as well. Other things like not understanding personal space. So this can be anything from the child that likes to talk like this in your face, right? Versus the children who just, again, don't have any inhibitions. They'll undress around others or undress others. Maybe the ones that are just constantly hugging and kissing, and they don't know like the boundaries of, move back a little bit, especially in this coronavirus world. The other thing that you might notice is, especially in the younger children, is touching mother's breasts, especially if this is a child that has been breastfed. They have that association with, well, something used to come out of this, what's going on over here now. And then this one particular behavior, there's a little bit of a caveat to it. So fingers or objects into the rectum or vagina, as long as it's not persistent. And what do I mean by that? So again, it's part of the self-exploration. So at some point, I have a friend of mine that years ago, her kids are older now, but years ago when her little girls were around this age and they used to play with Legos, one time she's texting us and she's like, "Yeah, my daughter thinks her vagina is a Lego pocket," and had put some Legos in her vagina. She never did it again, though, because you realize very quickly when you do that you probably don't like having Legos in your vagina. So you don't do it again, right? So it's a one-time kind of like, I did that. That wasn't very cool, and I'm not going to do it anymore. Now, if you have a child who is constantly doing this and can't be told not to do it, at that point, that's a behavior that you might question as being potentially problematic and a sign of something. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about problem sexual behaviors. So know that if this happens, once or twice and the kid learns, that's normal. If it's something ongoing, that changes categories. And they'll ask questions, like where do babies come from? I have 3 boys. Does everybody have a penis? That's a question I've been asked. I remember when I was pregnant with my 3rd child and my older 2 were asking about, why do I have a baby in there? And, I was talking about like the uterus and made them repeat the word uterus so that they knew where it was and how the baby gets fed in the belly and whatever. And my middle child, who at the time was 3, said, "You have a whole kitchen in there?" So, you're going to have to prepare yourself to have those kinds of conversations because they're going to be very curious and they're going to ask. So masturbation. I have a whole slide on this. Feel very comfortable with this word because it's going to come out a lot. So kids masturbate. They do. The peak incidence of masturbation in this age group is age 4. It decreases as they get a little bit older in elementary school, and then it picks right back up in adolescence. So, but in the age, the early ages, like the first stages, again, it's not necessarily a sexual thing. They are not thinking about sexual things when they are touching themselves at this point in life. It really is this is a body part that when I touch it, it feels nice. That's all it is. It's self-stimulatory. It has nothing to do with, having somebody else have done something to you in most cases. And we'll talk about when it becomes a problem later. So extremely common. It should not freak anybody out. And as long as the child can be taught that there's a place and time for these things, and they listen to that, then it's not a problem. So if you catch your child touching their genitals, then you have a conversation about, yes, that does feel good, but we don't do it in public because it is your private parts, and private parts are private. So it's safe to do it in your bedroom. It's safe to do it in the bathroom. Don't do it at the dinner table. Don't do it in front of grandma. Don't do it at school. So you have those conversations that, of course, you're going to find your own language and feel comfortable about it. Because you also don't want to teach kids that their parts are dirty, right? You don't want healthy sexuality to become shameful. And I think that that's something that we can see in different generations of our society, that there's such shame around normal sexual things that people don't enjoy that part of their lives as adults from messages that they were told as children. So you want to stay away from the shame and guilt and dirty. You're a dirty girl, you're a bad boy for doing these things, this is naughty, and switch it to part of your body. Respect that part of your body. It is a private part of your body, and this is things we do in private. It's kind of like, again, picking your nose. Everybody picks their nose. I mean, you do. You just do. So, but you're not going to do it at a meeting, right? You're not. That's bad manners, right? We don't do that at the dinner table. So if you put it in the context of other things that people do naturally that aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves, but just, maybe not the best thing to do in public, then fine. Well, we're going to talk about when this becomes a problem later, but essentially it's if you are giving your child all of these conversations and they keep doing it in public, that they're not being able to do something different if you tell them to stop. We'll get into that later. But this is, to me, a very comical study that was done in the Journal of Pediatrics in 2005. And it was a case study of 12 girls that they referred to a pediatric movement disorder clinic. So kids with neurologic issues, seizures, things like that. And as part of trying to figure out what was going on with these girls, whether they were having seizures or some other movement disorder, they sent cameras, or told the parents to have some cameras that they could then review the footage of what's going on with these spells, and so that they could help diagnose these girls better. And what they found is that these girls were having things like facial flushing or grunting and irregular breathing when they were having spells, and posturing, so arching their backs and so on and so forth, having rhythmic pelvic movements. And every time a parent would distract them, "Hey, Susie, go eat this cookie. Hey, Susie, let's watch TV," it would stop. Now, if you expect it to be a movement disorder, they have no control over it and they wouldn't stop. But stopping with distraction, obviously it's something that they could control. After seeing these videos and talking to parents and assessing the children, what they realized is that all of these girls were actually masturbating. And these were all toddler, 2 to 4 year old girls. So it just really goes to show that it can kind of look funny. It can kind of look weird. And it is very concerning to parents if they don't know what's going on. But it is extremely common behavior. When you get to your middle childhood years, you start understanding social cues a little bit better, right? So you're in elementary school now, you're around other peers and teachers. You also, this is a time of your development that you go from sort of the concrete way of looking at life to more abstract. And so you start understanding social appropriateness and social, decorum and social context, right? So you're not going to be running around naked at school. Maybe you're still going to do that at home with your parents. But, if there's family around, there's visitors in your house, you're not going to be running around naked in your house. You're going to start actually wanting to feel like your body is more yours, and you understand the private parts are private thing, and you want privacy when you're changing or taking a shower. You may still masturbate at this age, but you're going to understand that it is a private thing, and it also becomes less in general as far as frequency around this time of life. What you will have, and all of you guys that have early elementary school kids will know that potty humor, that's the funniest thing ever. And having a home full of boys, I can tell you that we are constantly hearing butt and fart jokes. I don't know if you guys know this, but if you guys have Alexas at home, you can tell her to fart. She has like 50 different farts. It's really kind of gross. But I know this because my kids found this out. So potty humor is really big. The other thing is that kids will start mimicking the gender roles that they're seeing in their environment. So they will know their defined gender, or what they have been told that they are, by age 3 or so. And this is around the time too that if you have a child that has a gender mismatch, so they've been biologically assigned to something, but they feel like there's something different, to feel that mismatch around that age where they've been told that they are a boy, they have classic boy parts, but maybe they don't feel like they are a boy inside their bodies. So you might notice this starting at around that time. Same time, they will, this is the time when children will start mimicking what they see in their culture and their environment of, what their gender assignments should act like at this age. And you might start noticing sexual play with peers. Now, the caveat to this is that it is generally the same age peers, oftentimes the same gender peers, and there is no differential power dynamic. And we're going to talk about this when we get into problem sexual behavior. So how to identify when this is an issue versus when this is normal childhood play. Sorry, I have the sniffles. So sexual play is a common behavior, and it's a common behavior cross-culturally. So when you look at different studies that have done to this, the percentages vary, but it can be anywhere from 37% of children to 78% of children, depending on the population and the countries that where the surveys were done. Again, it is same-sex peers, commonly the same age group peers. And again, it's not a sexual attraction thing, it's not a sexual intent thing. It is just more of curiosity. I have these body parts. Do you have these body parts? I'll show you mine, show me yours kind of game. A lot of times the issues come when adults, maybe you walk into two kids with their pants down with the show me yours and show me mine. And, if the adult acts towards it in a way that is, oh my God, you nasty little children, that is going to impact the child a lot more than the actual game itself, because the actual game itself is like, I just want to know what other people look like. So as adults, we have to really be careful, and it's difficult, right? I certainly am not I can lecture about this, but in my own home, I certainly kind of struggle with the messaging, because I think that it is often sort of shocking to us to kind of think about our children in that way, to have that kind of curiosity. And then depending on how we ourselves were raised to think about such things, those things are ingrained deeply. And so knowing and being prepared for these are normal things, and how will you react? And how will you talk to your kid about, yes, you're curious, and let's play something different, right? Is good to practice in your head, because in the moment, depending on your upbringing, it might be difficult to deal with. So you gotta have to know your own self with that. So common games that are normal, and this is in the literature. So we talked about, I'll show you mine, you show me yours. Things like playing house. So again, going back to the gender role. So I'll be the mom, you'll be the dad. Playing doctor. So your classic, let me actually take a good look at your genitals. And again, it's not necessarily a sexual thing. It's like, what's going on down there? And then games like chasing and kissing in the playground, and doing things of that nature. So a couple of different studies on sexual play. So there was one done, it's a little bit older, from 1983, but it was a good one. They talked to 128 undergraduate women and said, hey, what kind of stuff did you do as a kid? And 85% of them had played sexual games in childhood at some point. 25% of them had involvement of showing their genitals. 15% of them had involvement with touching another child's genitals while clothed, and 17%, so slightly higher, while unclothed. Now, the thing about this is, again, we talked about how normal play often is same gender. Cross-gender play did have an enhanced chance of being some sort of coercion or bullying within that. So that's something to kind of pay attention to as well. Several studies reported that these women, when they were asked, like, well, what did that feel like? They remember feeling thrilled or excited by the play, and then oftentimes also feeling guilty, depending on the cultural norms of their households. So again, going back to something that very frequently happens, but it's not necessarily understood or well thought of. And then interestingly, one study pointed out that a lot of these women said that they had memories of tingling sensations. So I bet they did. Okay. So late childhood. So this is when you start at that point actually getting interested. Okay. This is when the behavior later on in this, closer to the teenage years, might be more sexual, even though you might not realize that that's what they are there at the time. So this is like when you start having crushes, right? Oh my God, Billy is so cute, right? That kind of thing. You may start thinking about having a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Of course, at this age, what does that even mean, right? A lot of times for kids, it's not that you're going to do anything with boyfriend or girlfriend. You actually might not even talk to the person, but you think Susie's cute, so she's your girlfriend. You might start asking questions about sex and what things mean. And as kids, unfortunately, nowadays have a higher access to like pornography and things that they probably ought to not be seeing, those questions might be more than you would bargain for as a parent or a caretaker of children. But you got to be prepared for them because they're going to be curious. This goes again, interest in looking at nudity. And this is a huge issue because kids are going to be naturally curious. And guess what? they can Google stuff now. So if you're not someone who is very cautious about your child's web engagement, you need to be, because this is so readily available and it's just so much easier to get to nowadays, right? So they might draw sexual parts, they might use sexual words. This is a time where, you know, how we talked about masturbation is common in the sort of preschool, toddler time, goes down during elementary. This is a time when it might start ramping up again. Hopefully by this time they understand that this is a private thing that you do in private. And after we talk about these stages, I'll stop and see if anybody has questions, and then we'll continue forward. So, and then puberty. I mean, gosh, everybody remembers puberty, right? So at this point in your life, there's a lot of social pressures. There's a lot of peer pressures to do different things and to try different things. This is the time that, you know, maybe you start asking questions about your own sexuality, you know, in your own gender mismatch, if it's there. The time that you start questioning, you know, gosh, which, you know, who am I actually attracted to? And is that okay in my cultural setting, right? There's the responsibility of the actions that you take at that time. So, you know, your hormones are going crazy, but you don't have the life experience to know necessarily, or, you know, the developed frontal lobe to necessarily make the wisest choices. Questions about consent, questions about, you know, how do I use a condom? What kind of contraception can I use? Can I talk to my parents about contraception? This might be when you have your first breakup, you know, your first major, the first love or whatever. And so, you know, sometimes I think as adults, we tend to look back at that and kind of be like, you know, you're just a kid. You don't know what's happening. You don't know what you're doing. You know, this is not real love or whatever it is. But if you remember back to that time of your life, like those were real things for you. And so we have to look at our teenagers and take them seriously, because yes, they don't have the life experience, but because they don't have the life experience, you know, these things are really major, and they need people who love them and can guide them through it in an open and vulnerable way, so that they can absolutely make those right choices that will keep them safe and will, you know, keep them going forward in life in general. So I wanted, before we talk about who's having sex when, I wanted to pause and see what kind of questions you guys have, if any. Let's see. Okay, so Kathleen says, is it normal for preschool age children to draw genitals in their drawings? If so, what age should that stop? We don't really see that a whole lot until like later on in the teenage years. You might want to ask where they're getting that from. You know, is that something that, like, are they just drawing their own penis or their own vulva, or is that something that they have seen somewhere? So I would actually explore that a little bit more closely to see, like, where are they, why are they drawing that? And it could be very innocuous, but, you know, you probably ought to ask the question at that point. Okay, so let's see. Uh-oh, how do I close this screen? Any tips on how to have conversations about sex with a 10-year-old or books to read? We will totally get there at the end of the lecture, because I think that's an important question to ask. Okay. Now, how do I close the screen here? And then the chat. Is it appropriate for a toddler to rub their belly button and or nipples while sucking their thumb? I think it goes back to self-stimulation. So, you know, if it's something that for whatever reason feels good to them, it's probably okay. I guess you have to think about, what are they doing when they're rubbing their nipples? How are they doing that? But I think in general, once a kid finds a body part that feels good, they're going to continue that behavior. And it's just up to the adult to, distract them in the moment for them to think about something else. Any books we can recommend? So we'll get to those things at the end. Oh gosh, there's a lot of questions here. Okay. Even commercials or news briefs introduced things I'm not ready to have conversations with my granddaughters about. I honestly answered my son's questions as they came until we had the talk. That's important to keep communication open, absolutely. Okay, so no questions so far, just a lot of really good comments. All right, so we'll close that off. Okay, so let's keep going, and we'll continue asking more questions. So in high school, by the age of 15, 21% of girls have had their sexual debut. And that raises up to 53% by the age of 17. So that's not a huge window for you to start having those conversations. And then, of course, by age 20, you're out of high school, you're maybe off on your own. 79% of women have had their sexual debut. For boys, for some reason, I didn't find the breakdown of this, but between ages of 15 to 19, 44% of boys have had their sexual debut. So why do I bring this up? Because this is talking about intercourse, right? So by age 15, 21% of girls have had intercourse. Now you think back to your own sexual lives, and there's probably a whole lot that you did before you actually got to the point of intercourse. Maybe not, but for many people, there's a whole lot that you did beforehand. And you don't want to have that conversation at 15, right? You probably don't want to have that conversation at 13. You probably want to start the conversation way earlier. We're going to talk about that because you want to make sure that by the time statistically people are having sex for the first time, that they know how to protect themselves from STDs, protect themselves from pregnancy and consent, how to say no, how to say yes, how to ask for consent, right? Because that's an important tool too. We tend to think about educating our girls about how to put up those boundaries, and that's super extremely important. But I can tell you, as a mother of sons, I'm going to be talking to my kids about how to ask for consent, because that's equally important to raise men who know how to be respectful about those things, right? And so you don't want to catch that when they've already started doing all the things, right? You want to catch that before they start doing all the things. So that's really, really important. Okay, so as far as people's sexual debuts and who they're having sex with, 74% of girls had sex with what they consider to be a significant other, compared to 51% of boys who had sex with who they consider to be a significant other. So that's a little bit of discrepancy there. So just, have those conversations with your girls and boys. And only 2% and 7% respectively had sex with someone they just met. And now they didn't actually quantify, like, did you just meet him today or did you meet him last month? Like, what is just met? But I think that the numbers of kids having sex with a significant other is really also important, because yes, we have this tendency to think about teenagers as being, with the crazy hormones and, wanting to have sex all the time and whatnot. And that might be true physiologically, but a lot of kids are still choosing to have sex with people they believe to be in a relationship with, that they believe that they are in love with, right? So part of sex education isn't just, let's talk about condom use and, STI prevention and, consent, all very important things, but it's also like, what is a healthy relationship? What is respect in a relationship? What does it mean to be in a relationship? Right? That's all part of sex education. And you've got to have those conversations too, so they can make the right decision of like, is this okay for me? Is this something that I really want to do, even if it's with somebody that I consider to be a significant other? And when we look at contraception use, this actually made me feel good about the world slightly. A lot of kids are using it. So for kids, for girls ages 15 to 16, 79% of them will use some sort of contraception. Generally, it is a condom. And then when you get older, it is 83%. Now, here's the thing. If they are starting their sexual debut at less than 14, it drops down a lot. So only 57% of that age group is using any kind of contraception. For boys, I was very happily surprised at these statistics too. So 93% of them are using some sort of contraception, generally condoms. 91% for ages 17 to 19. I wonder why that drops. Are you just becoming slightly less responsible at that time? Doesn't make sense, but okay, statistics. It's not a significant difference. But again, ages 14 and less is 78%, which was surprisingly high, but still, not what we'd like it to be. And like we talked about, condom use was the most common thing. I did want to touch base on sexual minorities here. So again, this is the time of life when, if you're going to be questioning your sexuality, this is the time that you might start having those questions. So LGBTQ youth started feeling different than peers from very early memories, like we talked about early, like, age 3, you might start feeling that gender mismatch. And the feelings of gender nonconformity. So, you don't feel like you're the typical gender. So, you're the classic examples like, oh, you're a boy that people keep pushing you to play football, but you'd rather do theater. I know that's a very cliche, but, the things like that. And the thing about it is that these kids do have higher ACE scores, so higher adverse childhood experiences, because they just didn't, many felt like they couldn't feel comfortable in their own skin, or that perhaps their sexuality choices would not be supported by their family or their culture. And for this youth, the attractions to the same sex start happening at the exact same time as heterosexual youth. So sometimes people say, it was like, well, how do you know that you're gay or transgender? Like, if you're a teen, I mean, that's too young to know. They might be just wanting attention or whatever people say. And it's like, no, you actually do, because your biology says that you are attracted to whoever you're attracted to. And that starts at the same time as your heterosexual peers. And that attraction, just like your heterosexual peers, increases during puberty as well. So those are important conversations to have with kids as well, about acceptance and about, gender roles in society versus what they feel like, and allowing those children to feel accepted and that they have an open place to talk to. Okay, so now we're going to get into problem sexual behaviors, but there's a couple questions. Okay, let's see. I'm so glad that there are other people who like to make Alexa fart. Thank you for that.
And Dr. Brown, I'm sorry to interject. There were 2 questions I just posted. I don't know if you can see them, or if you want me to read them. They were at the top of the chat, and so I wanted to make sure they had their questions presented.
Yeah. Make sure I'm not missing them, because I can't see. The ones that I saw, the ones that I were answered before. So I don't know if there's new ones.
Did you answer the one about, let's see, is it normal for a 4-year-old to play with his penis for about 3 to 5 minutes most times before he begins to urinate? Did you do that one already?
No, that's a new one. It certainly can be. So remember that 4 is kind of like the peak of masturbation at that age. And it might be because, Are they, so it's right before urination. So are they trying to hold it, right? Because like I'm playing with my toys and I don't want to go pee. Is it because, is there some stimulation there? Some feelings there, like physical feelings there because they're about to go pee, that makes that stimulation feel good or makes that feeling of going pee feel better. So there's reasons why a boy would do that. What I would say is if you're able to distract them, so that they're not doing that behavior anymore, and you're able to say, hey, we don't play with our privates in public, and they stop, then that would be a typical behavior. I would be more concerned if it's something that they can't ever be redirected or continue on for longer. But I think that if you notice it right before they urinate, there's probably stimulatory reasons for them that would make that feel good for whatever reason. And I wouldn't worry about that too much as long as you're able to redirect them. And there was another question?
Yes, and I'm sorry, Dr. Brown. Yeah, there was a second question. It said, what language do you suggest to replace the outdated good touch, bad touch?
Right. So we don't use good touch, bad touch anymore because, and we can get into that a little bit when we talk about problem sexual behaviors. If you are a person who is perpetrating sexual abuse on a child, it actually may be very confusing to a child to use that language when they're trying to disclose, because just because there's a behavior that you don't like doesn't mean that your body isn't stimulated or it doesn't feel good. So someone might actually touch you sexually, like a sexual perpetrator or child molester would, and you don't want that interaction, but your genitals respond because that is just a physical thing that happens, and you have zero control over your genital response, right? So, because that's completely physiologic. So, well, it wasn't a good touch, but it did feel good, and I didn't like it that it felt good. So it's very confusing. So generally, when we teach kids about these things, you talk to them about, has anybody made you feel uncomfortable? Because it kind of takes it away from the touch, and just like, what are you feeling when this is happening? Because you're not going to want this to be happening, even if your body is reacting in a positive way. So has anybody made you feel uncomfortable? Has anybody touched your privates? Like, just take it away from good touch, bad touch in general. So you want to use language that describes the situation and not so much the action of the touch, because that's confusing. I hope that helps. And we can talk about that a little bit later with the section that we're starting. Any other questions?
Those are the only ones that I saw, and I apologize to everybody. There's 303 people on this session, so I apologize if I missed anybody. Scroll through it. Thank you for sharing.
Yes. Thank you. There are behaviors that are problematic and that are concerning and that you need to pay attention to. So the Sexual Behavior Problems Task Force put out a very the good definition that we should all kind of keep in mind when we're talking about problem behaviors. So sexual behavior problems are, or children that have these, are children that are less than 12. Let me just read this verbatim. Who initiate behaviors involving sexual body parts that are developmentally inappropriate or harmful to themselves and others. And that's the key: developmentally inappropriate or harmful to themselves and others. And we're going to get into what these are. So developmentally inappropriate, what is that? So when a child is doing something much earlier than what is developmentally or culturally expected. So, as a child abuse pediatrician, we see a lot of kids, young kids in our clinic who have been molested. And sometimes that that information comes about when kids start describing or doing things that don't make sense in the context of their age. So if you have a 4-year-old that, for example, is masturbating, well, that's one thing. But if that 4-year-old is masturbating in such a way that they can never be distracted, that they continue doing it all the time, and they're doing it in public, or if they are, simulating copulation, like simulating intercourse, if they are simulating oral sex, if they are describing scenes or asking questions about things that they should not know about. If your 4-year-old asks you about oral sex, that is a key that something's not right? Because they have no context of that, and that is not a self-stimulating behavior. So when you take things that an much older kid would know or an adult would know and put it in the mouths of a child, that's not developmentally appropriate, and that is a red flag. You should get that checked out. When it's something that preoccupies the child, so we go back to the masturbatory behavior. So when that's a problem, and I keep saying, well, when they can't be distracted, if it's something that they're doing constantly and they're saying, oh, this is something that so and so did to me. Of course, you have to start asking questions like, why are you doing this all the time? And see if a child will disclose something to you. If it's other behaviors that are being preoccupied, so kids who are overly curious about, say, mothers, private parts, to the extent that they say, but mommy, I want to touch your vagina, or I want to do this, or describing sexual behaviors. That's a problem. Something that keeps reoccurring even with adult correction. So, hey, honey, don't do that in public, but they're still doing that in public and calling attention to it. That's problematic. So potentially harmful. So when they start doing this to other children and there is coercion or force or intimidation, not talking about let me show you my privates and you show me yours. I'm talking about, the kids who are bigger, maybe in size or maybe in age, the kids who threaten, don't tell anybody, let's keep this a secret. The kids who are forceful in what they're doing, like physically forceful or even psychologically forceful what they're doing, those are problem things. When you have a power differential, that's a huge red flag. And if it's something that's also interfering with a child's social development, if it goes back to not being able to be distracted, doing things in inappropriate places, like, are they doing this in the school bathroom? Are they, doing this on the playground, things like that? These behaviors are low frequency. So we talked about the normal sexual behaviors being high frequency. This is something you don't see very often, right? I mean, I see it all the time in my clinic, but that's because we do sex abuse clinic. So compulsive masturbation, sexual coercion of other children, attempted intercourse, right? Oral genital contact. These things are things that kids, especially outside of the teenage age, have no context for in their life. They have not seen this, right? They should not have seen this. Insertion of objects into the rectum or vagina. We talked about this earlier. At some point, you may find that you have a hole down there and you might want to stick something in it. And you're going to find that that's incredibly unpleasant and you're not going to do it again. If that's something that you keep doing, why? Why do you keep doing that? Did something happen? You start having to ask those questions. Imitating sexually explicit sounds or acts, right? Imitating sexual moaning or noises, or imitating, grinding on top of somebody or something like that. Those are not normal. And again, you have to look at the age and the context of the situation. Some of this is going to be obvious and some of this is going to be more nuanced, especially with the questions of self-stimulation. You know, is this just normal for you, or is it something that we have to be worried about? And again, the key things on self-stimulatory behaviors is, can they be distracted in the moment? Are they obsessed with it, or is it something that they just do from time to time? And are you constantly doing it in front of grandma? Like, can we just put it, you know, in your privates?
Hey,
So,
Dr. Brown, I am so sorry to interject. So we only have a few more minutes left. I was supposed to give you a warning. We only have a few more
oh,
minutes. And then Carla, I know it goes by so quickly. Carla Griffin did have a quick question. I don't know if you have time, but I wanted to make sure that I let her ask if we have time. We only have maybe 3 minutes.
mhm.
Carla, are you still there? Carla Griffin? If you want to unmute yourself and you had a quick question, Carla. Let's see. Okay. Well, okay, so we are at 3 minutes. Okay, go ahead.
I don't know how that happened. So here are the things that I want to take home about. So kids with sexualized behavior problems, we tend to think that they've been sexually abused, and oftentimes that is the case. But there are other kinds of abuse that will lead the children to do this. So physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence, or witnessing over-sexualized behaviors in the home. And I think the thing to remember is that these kind of behaviors are not often, or often not necessarily a mode of getting sexual pleasure for the kids. It is a form of getting out aggression. So a lot of times you may not have been sexually abused, but especially in cases of where there's bullying and coercion and violence involved, that's when the physical abuse portion of things comes out. So it's important to remember that it's not just sexual abuse, it is other forms of abuse like that also that may lead to certain kinds of behavior, especially in older children. And so just to kind of hurry through, with these kids though, there is hope. Lots of times we tend to think, oh my God, they're going to grow up to be child molesters. No, they're not. When you look at them compared to the regular population, very few of them actually grow up to be perpetrators as adults. Especially if they get cognitive behavior therapy about it. So it's important that if you have a kid with these kind of behaviors, put them in cognitive behavior therapy and get some coping mechanisms for them to not make those behaviors anymore. I don't usually run out of time so much for this talk, so I'm so sorry. But here are the other things, just as far as what to do and how to talk about things that I want to bring up because I think it's important. Start early. You can start with toddlers. And what do you do? You say the right terms, right? You have a penis, you have a vulva, these are nipples. Use the words. Also because that keeps them safer. Kids who don't know the words for their body parts, perpetrators can teach them the wrong words. Like we've had people say, you know, this is that their vulva was their knee, and the kid kept saying, oh, he's touching my knee, he's touching my knee, and people were like, okay, he's touching your knee. It wasn't until a forensic interview with a drawing that's like, oh, that's your vagina, that's not your knee. So teach them the right words. There's a lot of different books that you can have, and you know, I mean, look, Amazon has like a plethora of kids books that just show them body parts, you know, drawings and things like that. Make it developmentally appropriate. So you're going to go into stepping stones of what you say to every kid. And it's going to be frequent and in small doses. A lot of people are used to sitting down and having the talk. Especially for teenagers, they're like, oh my God, mom, I don't, that's not, and we're not having this conversation, right? So you bring it up in different ways. So with your teenagers, you're watching a show together and maybe there's an interaction of the two characters that are in love. And you're like, so what do you think about that interaction? What do you think about how they're handling things? What do you think that they're talking about? Right. So those are the ways that you bring up questions about consent and relationship, maybe through movies and TV shows and things that you read. For all ages, read books together, age appropriate books together, so that folks are comfortable asking you questions. And from the very early ages, teach children about consent. And that can start simply when they're little kids and they don't want to hug Auntie Susie. And you're like, okay, I don't want to hug Auntie Susie. Sorry, Auntie Susie. But let them have that body autonomy. My 3-year-old the other day, I grabbed him and I was just kissing him. And he's like, no, mommy, no. And I was like, you don't want my kisses? And he's like, respect. And I was like, for reals? You're 3.5. But hey, I guess I taught you something. And so I stopped kissing him. But you can start from that age on. And then start talking about things that assure safety. So you want your kids to know that they're not going to get in trouble first. At first, you're going to be there to help them and support them, and they can tell you anything, and you're going to listen. Because if they think that, oh my God, if I tell my mom this, she's going to kill me, guess who they're not going to tell? They're not going to tell you. So you need to expect uncomfortable, awkward conversations, expect them frequently, and bring them up frequently. Use your surroundings, use your everyday life to bring up these issues. If your kids, when they're older, are talking about what happens in the playground or what happened with their friends, have conversations about that. My 5-year-old, the other 6-year-old now, just had a birthday. The other day was talking about how some kid named Henry at school on the playground was running around trying to kiss a girl. And I was like, okay, well, did she want kisses? Like, no. Okay, well, was that okay for Henry to be doing that? Well, no. So just use life as a way to embark on these conversations. It doesn't have to be this like big to-do, let's sit down and have this talk thing. Like just do it in little spurts, because they'll hear it more and they'll keep it more, and they'll feel safe to ask you the questions when they have important questions to ask. Okay, how many minutes do we have left?
We're kind of over, but I just wanted, because I wanted to make sure that I honored everybody's questions. Ms. Griffin had asked, there was a student, they thought that he was masturbating, but he was uncircumcised. So I don't know if you wanted to, address that scenario.
Okay, can you tell me more about that scenario?
Oh, unfortunately, she can't unmute, so I guess she could put it in the chat. Let me see if there's any more information. Let's see. Oh, okay. She said, he wasn't. What was happening is the pee was making him itch, so he was scratching her, trying to relieve the itch. And they realized he was not masturbating. It could have been a whole thing for nothing. So she just wanted to address that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, right? We assume, because we have the sexual context in our heads. And so we see these behavior in children and assume things. Now with the problem sexual behaviors, maybe you should assume some things, but with the common things, the high frequency behaviors, we can't assume that children are doing what they're doing for a sexual end game. A lot of times it is the itch you have to scratch. It is just like, kind of feels good. It is, I gotta pee and maybe I don't want to pee, or maybe this kind of feels good when I'm trying not to pee. So there's so many reasons that are not sexual for younger children. Here are just some things that you want to think about with your, especially teens, that you want to ensure you're part of the conversation. It's a long laundry list, but you're going to want to talk about body safety for boys and girls, consent for boys and girls, how to give and receive consent, obviously the STI and pregnancy preventions, healthy relationships. Don't neglect talking about pleasure, right? I mean, if sex is done properly, sex feels good. And we don't want to be in a situation where we're setting up our kids for later on in life when they're adults and loving relationships, that they're not going to enjoy that part of their lives because it feels shameful or taboo. Health maintenance, you got to go get your parts checked. Menstruation, gender diversity and inclusion, IPV, so domestic violence, sexting and pornography are going to be big topics, especially in this generation. So it's a lot of things to talk about. There's lots of good books, and I'll compilate a list if you guys want, and can send these things out to you. So that you can keep that in mind, read books together and use everyday scenarios to bring up conversations so that they're not quite so awkward and they feel more spontaneous. So I missed talking about certain things. We didn't talk about sex education at school because that was a big thing. And I kind of skipped over the kinds of therapies for sexual problem behaviors. But I do want to make sure that we respect your time. We ran out, and that we answer any other questions or address any other comments.
Thank you so, so much, Dr. Brown. And I am so sorry. We are actually way past time. There's another session going on. The inclusive conversation session is going on right now, everybody. And I believe they're giving out prizes. Maybe there'll be a prize for somebody attending that, for people attending that session, for one person. So thank you so, so much, Dr. Verena Brown. We appreciate your honesty and your expertise and your knowledge about this. I know as a parent, and for many of us on the session, this is a very difficult subject and awkward conversation that we kind of like cringing to have this conversation with our children or the children that we may work with. So thank you so, so much. We're so grateful to have you in our space today. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me.